Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. So you want to be a red teamer. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Jorge Orchilles, Certified SANS Instructor, and Jean-François Maes, SANS Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Carol, and hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to hang out with Jean and myself today. I know in the US might be a holiday, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, so really appreciate you being here. And if you don't have a holiday, well, you're at least gonna enjoy an hour with us away from work, hopefully. I'm Jorge Orchilles, and this is So You Want to Be a Red Teamer? It's a question we get asked quite a bit from people coming from all over the industry, whether it's IT or software development. Some people that just are getting into cybersecurity, they hear about red teaming and want to know a little more. So we're going to talk about it. I'm going to tell my story. John's going to tell his story. Everyone's going to be different, right? So if anything, that will be the message, right? You are unique, and there is space for you in information security. There's definitely space for you on the red team side. So regardless of what you might hear out on Twitter or somewhere else, we are very inclusive, and we're happy to have you here joining us. So I am Jorge Orchilles. I am one of the speakers here. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Scythe, a adversary emulation platform used by red teamers. A little about me before I got into that. I started as a system administrator at a company called Terramark, and there they had a security operations center. I thought that was super cool. So I went there and worked as a SOC analyst for about 2 years. And then through networking and ISSA in particular, you can see that there, I met people and was talking with folks, and they said, hey, look, Citi is hiring ethical hackers. I'm like, what? You can get paid for being an ethical hacker? And this was like 10 plus years ago, right? So I checked that out, and the original title was Vulnerability Assessment Analyst. And we're gonna go through what that means, but after a few years of doing that, I proposed that we actually do penetration testing, and there was a lot of fear around this, being at a major bank that moves trillions of dollars a day. Imagine bringing something down, right? That's like everyone's fear. And we proved that it was possible to exploit systems in production without bringing them down. And then we noticed that the only way people were getting in wasn't necessarily breaking technology, but also going after people and process. That's when we proposed the red team, which has a bit to do with technology, yes, but it's really looking at any situation from the view of an adversary. So lots of differences there that we're going to cover. And then started doing some purple teaming, which is working together with the blue team instead of doing these zero knowledge engagements that no one knew about. We started working with them. So as you teach folks, it was actually a nice, efficient way of getting better, right? And by no means do I mean stop doing red teaming or pen testing. So we're going to cover all of that. Other than that, I am a certified SANS instructor and the author of Security 564, Red Team Exercises and Adversary Emulation. It's a 2-day course. We'll talk a bit about that. Lots of the stuff in here is about that. We just released an update that's going live in February. So hopefully you all can join me for that. And I also teach 560 and 504, which are network pen testing and hacker tools, techniques, exploits, and incident handling, which I actually taught last week. So lots of cool stuff there, done other industry contributions, but we really want to highlight this picture here of when I worked in corporate America, had to wear ties and stuff like that. And I went to Berlin to teach, and I met Jean there. He was actually my facilitator. This was a couple of years ago. And he's like, hey, George, you know, you don't look like the guy on that on your LinkedIn profile. You should fix that. So thanks to Jean and Sans that actually took the picture. This is a more accurate representation of what I look like. See, kind of, no, a
It's
little bit.
much better, George. It's much better now.
Thanks, John.
For
I
sure.
appreciate it. But it's still not as good as this headshot. Who are you? Can you tell us a little about
Boom.
yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Jean-François Maes, and I'm a senior red teamer at Nviso, which is a Belgian cybersecurity firm that primarily does anything related to cybersecurity. So that goes from strategy to architecture and to, of course, also detection and offensive security, which part of it is actually red teaming. Starting from last year, I also founded a website called redteamer.tips, which is basically a website that I brought to life just so I can basically dump some stuff that I find online so I can find it back later myself and in the process help other red teamers do the same thing. I'm a big believer in open sourcing tools as well because yeah, I think that a lot of our toolage, actually also what we use in Nviso, comes from an open source world. And if you open source your tooling, you make the world a safer place because then security guys can also write detection rules for it. And I'm officially, since this year, an instructor candidate for the SEC 699 as well. And I actually co-teached my first 699 last week as well, George. Boom. And thank you, by the way, for inviting me because I wrote a blog post about it, how to become a red teamer or pen tester. And I think that's the primarily reason why George actually invited me to this webcast. So nice. Thanks.
No problem. And no, apart from that, it's that I did want to show that all of us get to red teaming in different ways, right? You have your path, I had mine, and everyone's going to have their own. So you know, apart from you being a great presenter and have a cool story to share with us, it's always good to have a few people, right? The other thing is that if you all have questions, since it's two of us, only one will be talking at a time, you can actually post your questions now. And as we go through, we'll answer them as best as we can, or we'll type out the answer for you. But do interact with us, please.
For sure.
And now, how did you get into InfoSec?
Yeah, so how did I get into InfoSec? I want to take the time to actually jump back into history with me because my resume isn't as impressive yet as George. I actually am only 26 years old right now, so my InfoSec journey is quite young, which is why I took the time to actually tell this story for you guys. So this is actually a bit too far back, George. I'm just a kid back then, so you can fast forward a little bit. So when I was a teenager, I was basically obsessed with playing video games, and that's what I wanted to do as a job as well. I wanted to become a professional esports player, but back then, esports wasn't as big as it is becoming right now. My parents definitely were against becoming a professional esports player because A, they have never heard of it, and B, they didn't consider that as a real job. So they basically told me, yeah, don't do that and get a degree so you can actually land a decent job. So that's actually what I ended up doing. And while I was doing college, I also started working some side gigs to earn some money, of course. And I ended up with two jobs, both in sales. One of them was for Microsoft Belgium, which was to promote their Surface tablet, which was back then a complete revelation. It was an iPad killer, so to say. So I went from store to store, quotation marks there. I went from store to store to actually promote the Surface, and I also landed a job as customer support for Proximus, which is a Belgian telecom company. All that while I was studying in school, trying to get a degree in computer science with as a major. I was a system engineer, so I did that in Ghent, which is Ghent is a city in Belgium, a small city in Belgium, but Belgium is small, so all cities are small. And two noteworthy teachers were there, both displayed left and right. So on the left we had Yuri, which was my teacher Windows Server, and on the right we had Bert, which was my teacher Linux and Linux servers. And basically what ended up happening was I was actually one of the worst students ever. I almost never went to, well, I did went to class, but I almost spent the entire class just talking with my friends and talking about video games, basically, because that's what I wanted to do. I played video games and I didn't really care about school. Until one day, Yuri, which gave a Windows Server, had enough of me. and told me back then that if I didn't change my attitude, I would probably end up without a degree and just doing some meaningless job. And that really hit me because I was like, okay, this guy thinks I can do nothing. So I wanted to prove him wrong, and I started to actually study. And that's where Bert also basically convinced me to get more into open sourcing and into system engineering in general, because he is a very passionate teacher, and his passion rubbed off on me a bit. So I ended up doing an internship at Inuit, which is an open source consultancy firm, and they taught me all about DevOps, basically setting up continuous integration pipelines with Jenkins, and they taught me about Docker as well. So that was really nice. I was really grateful for that. But once I did my internship there, I basically told myself that this wasn't really the approach I wanted to go for, and I started continuing my job search, and I landed a job at Dimension Data, which is where I met Yves Janssens and Tom Gillis. And Yves is actually the guy that introduced me to pen testing, because I was a young graduate then, and they basically allowed me to taste all the services they had to offer. And Dimension Data is quite a big service provider, and penetration testing and security is one of those services. So basically, Yves showed me my first reverse shell ever, because I had this wrong idea that hackers were always writing in assembly and were like 9,000 IQ people. And basically, when the first reverse shell popped, I knew in that instance that that's something I wanted to do for like almost the rest of my life. And what happened then was I started studying about pen testing, and I actually had a job with Dimension Data, which was a service line engineer, which basically means that I had to provide solutions to level 1 customers. And what happened was a lot of repetitive tasks were coming in, so I started automating most of my work, which is I created Stalker script, and that's basically something I created. It's basically just a Frankenstein script written in Python that leverages several APIs, which made my life considerably easier, and I had more free time to spend on pen testing. And I actually gave a presentation. It was my first presentation ever in 2018 about just some a vulnerable Docker image that I found, and I basically obtained root privileges on the host. And that was such a success that I actually ended up getting live streamed, because that's something I had never done before, and suddenly my first presentation was getting live streamed. So that was quite nice. And then basically, because Dimension Data is quite big, and their service, their penetration testing service, was not their core business, they wanted more senior profiles in their pen testing team. So there wasn't really a place for me in the team back then. And one of my colleagues actually talked to me about Nviso, which is the company I work for now. And he told me that Nviso was actually hiring, and maybe I should take a shot there. So that's what I did. I submitted my resume to Nviso and got hired by Tim on the left and Jonas on the right. And if you look in the middle, that's actually Eric, which is one of the co-founders of Nviso, and he's actually a SANS instructor as well. So if you happen to take a SANS event, chances are that you might run into him as well. And basically, when I started at Nviso, I started as a web pen tester, because that's how basically almost everyone starts in the offensive team of Nviso. It's as a web tester, just so you can learn the ropes and learn a bit more about how pen testing works, and then get a decent methodology in your system. And then basically, because I had a system engineering background, I transitioned into network infrastructure pen testing, and ultimately red teaming by extent. There we go. Then I started studying up quite a bit, because as a pen tester, I realized that I lacked knowledge. I was a system engineer, but I didn't have in-depth knowledge on how can we leverage this to actually get a reverse shell, or how do we get to main admin. And basically, I started studying. So my journey started with SANS. I took the 560 with Jorge, was his facilitator, and I crashed like all his systems constantly. He was he told me I was actually one of the worst facilitators ever, because I was blue screening all his systems all the time. And then I got OCP. I started studying with Pentester Academy as well, got a certified red team professional. And then I got in contact with Rastamaus, which is one of the open source red teamers out there as well. Quite famous actually for his AMSI bypass. And I realized that he launched a course called Certified Red Team Operator, and I took that as well. then transitioned into OSCE, and ultimately became a certified red team expert by Pentester Academy as well. So that's a bit my story. I also started writing tools as well because we adopted Cobalt Strike at Nviso. Because Cobalt Strike is actually a command and control, which you will hear about more later today. And Cobalt Strike leverages a technique called execute assembly, which is actually capable of running .NET assemblies in memory. And I started writing some tools for that, one of which is ClippyB, which I thought back then was a brilliant idea because I thought I was inventing something really nice. It's basically a clipboard stealer. And it turns out that some guys at SpectreOps already created something quite similar to this and was way more popular. So I spent some time on that, but it's actually quite nice because I learned more about C# and started developing more and more toolage. And then one of my latest tools is Sharp ZipRunner. And as you can see, my stars on GitHub also went up from 22 to 156. I started writing more complex code, and I'm now an open source tool developer, basically, as a side job.
Nice. Yeah, I hear being having an open source tool actually requires a lot of time, especially when people start opening issues and complaining about things.
That's true. Do you remember the one issue at Mimikatz where they just said your program contains a virus? It went so viral. It's insane.
Yep. So no, awesome story, Jean, and thank you for coming on and accepting the invite to come speak. Like I said, the whole thing is people are different, right? Everyone's different. You're going to be different, and you can come different ways, right? Jean kind of got into the InfoSec part through web apps. I came more from a system administrator and security operations center side and focusing more on network and infrastructure. But really the commonality there is that you need to understand how things work, right? And that's kind of what being a hacker is. So we're going to cover some basic definitions just to differentiate hacking and vulnerability assessment and penetration testing and red teaming, and then really focus on you, on the people, right? Whenever we talk about anything, we kind of break it up into people, process, and technology. So a lot of the focus here is going to be people. We are going to cover a little bit of process, a little bit of technology, and of course, leave you with the SANS promise, which I'm sure you've all heard before, but pretty much any webcast that we do, any class that we run, we promise you that you will have something to take away and use immediately afterwards. So whether you're new to this or seasoned, whether you're new to IT or not, we plan to give you some free stuff that allows you to go and get better, right? Always improve. We need more people in information security, and especially in the offensive side. So we welcome you. So let's get to it. The first thing we need to talk about is being a hacker. What does a hacker mean? Well, a hacker is a skilled individual who understands technology and leverages and maybe modifies that technology to overcome a problem. A hacker is not a criminal. Hacking is not a crime. A criminal is someone who engages in illegal activity. Everything that we are going to talk about here, you must, and you really, please do get permission. Don't go do something illegal because that makes you a criminal, and we don't train criminals, we train hackers. So that's the very basis of everything. As you go into it, you're going to learn how something works, whether it was through coding or you were a developer and you created a web app, or you built a network and you were a network administrator, right? That understanding of how something works and then the drive to make it do what you want is what makes you a hacker, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Now, there's a whole lot of things in the offensive security space and what some people call ethical hacking, which means you have permission, but most organizations and even a lot of people, I, for example, started this way. We started first running vulnerability scans. And I'm sure you've heard about some of these tools like Nessus or Nexpose or Rapid7's Insight VM. They keep changing the name on us, or Qualys, or your Nmaps and your app scans, right? All those are vulnerability scanners. There are tools. And what you do with them is you point them to an IP address or a range of IP addresses or a web app, and it goes through and sends a bunch of data, receives data, and based on signature mapping, it can tell you where there might be some vulnerabilities, where there might be some patches that haven't been applied, where there's a configuration issue, and things like that. And that's generally where most companies and most people start, because you kind of need to understand what's there before going to attack it. And then vulnerability assessments, where we add the human to it, right? That people part. You go through these results and you're going to validate them. You're going to verify that that vulnerability exists. And you're also going to calculate the risk of that vulnerability. See, tools don't know context. A system that's internal and might be just for information purposes to tell you what days you have off is probably less risky than an internet-facing system that you use as the basis of your e-commerce, right? So the same vulnerability on both systems would probably be rated differently. And that's where we need humans, right? That's where you have to think about it. One of the things I've done in my career is worked with the common vulnerability scoring system. I was on the working group for version 3 and 3.1, and I know we get a lot of hate online, but the real basis of it is that you have a base score that is calculated by the vendor, but then you need to calculate the environmental and the temporal score because you add context. You can't automate that part, right? So this is where we start getting people involved and verifying vulnerabilities exist and prioritizing what needs to get fixed. Then, once you've verified a vulnerability exists, you might want to actually exploit that vulnerability or take advantage of that flaw in that system that you found. And that was the basis, or is the basis, of penetration testing. Not only are you finding vulnerabilities, but you're also getting in. And the whole reason to do that is to gain even more business context, right? You find a SQL database, you get SQL injection through some web app. Great. What can you do? What were you able to read? Were you able to read customer information, HR information, compensation information, right? So exploitation allows you to have that context. And here we have some different tools, right? Many of you may have heard of Immunity Canvas. Shout out to them as a South Florida company. I am a South Floridian, so like them a lot. Or Core Impact from Core Security, or the one that I'm sure all of you have heard of, right? The free one is Metasploit, right? The Metasploit framework. It's an exploit framework. It actually allows you to find vulnerabilities, exploit them, bundle them with a payload, and gain you that shell access, right? So in this case, a lot more manual. Again, using the person, right? You don't want to like just auto-pwn. I don't know if you remember that word. Did you ever play with auto-pwn, Jean? Did you hear about that?
I did. There are still some auto-pwn tools out there. So you have the Cobalt Strike extension as well.
I think that's why you were blue screening my machines in that SEC 560, because you were just throwing exploits out there, seeing if something would get caught. And that's the whole thing of exploitation. If you do it wrong, you might crash the system, you might crash the service. And doing that professionally in an enterprise will not get you a good rap, right? Of course, Jean had permission to do what he was doing, and it was a lab environment. And although a little annoying that I had to revert, it was fine. He can do it there. I hope you don't do that with any of your clients.
No, I didn't do it.
Of course not. And then we have red teaming, right? And the biggest difference here is that red teaming looks at those 3 tiers we talked about: people, process, and technology. Red teamers might use exploits, but that's just going to be a means to an end. And what I really love here on this slide, on the bottom right, is the Red Team Journal. They're back. The Red Team Journal has been around since 1997, and their definition of red teaming is one that I love, and it's the practice of looking at a problem or situation from the perspective of an adversary. So in this case, you're not really going after those technology preventive controls, right? Those missing patches and whatnot. You're going after the whole holistic item, right? And your goal here is to make the blue team better. Who is the blue team? Are the defenders, right? Are defenders. Before you were testing against vendor products and whatnot, operations team. But the blue team, they're people too, and they have a process and they have some technology and some security controls. And their whole goal is to detect and respond to any of these attacks. So we test those out, and generally most red team engagements are going to be zero knowledge engagements. That's where the red team comes in, and maybe only the CISO or the head of security knows about this particular item, because you want to train and measure those people. So one thing I put together after doing this for a number of years in a large financial was this maturity model, right? Where did we start, 10, 12 years ago, and how did we get to where we were? And in particular here, and also talking to other larger organizations, everyone starts with vulnerability scanning, then they do vulnerability assessment, then pen testing, then brought in the red team. And then apart from doing those annual red team engagements, especially when you have an internal red team, what else can you do? Well, purple teaming came about, and that was really working and collaborating with the blue team. So you as a red teamer, you still are operating under that goal of making the blue team better. You're just not going full zero knowledge. Sometimes when something new comes out, you work together. And then the final one there is adversary emulation, which is a little harder even, because when we talk about red teaming, we're going to cover a lot of TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? And as a red teamer, do you know how to do all 525 of them? Gets a lot harder. So we study how various adversaries work, and then we go and do these. So this by no means is a step-by-step guide. Your organization might do this different. All of that's totally fine. This is just how a few organizations I've talked to and I work with in my day-to-day have done it. Now, as we were talking about this, John mentioned something quite interesting. And yes, this is another slide, and this is the people edition, right, John?
Yeah, indeed. So from my point of view, I think a lot of pen testers and red teamers out there actually adopt this maturity model as well in their own respective careers. So as George already illustrated with his own professional career, he as well started as a vulnerability scanning, and then ended up with purple teaming and adversary emulation. And that's also how I did it, but that doesn't necessarily reflect on you per se. For example, if you are a very dedicated system admin for 20 plus years, or I don't know, it could be less, could be more, and you want to transition into red teaming, then maybe your mileage will differ, because you have a different skill set, of course. So it all depends on where you're coming from and where you want to go. You don't become a red teamer overnight. You need some knowledge as well, which you can get depending on where you're at. If you're a student, if you're a software developer. But the most important thing is that you don't have to compare yourself to others. Everyone has their own lifestyle. Everyone has their own time allocation as well. Some people spend 20 hours after a computer and sleep for 4. Others have a wife, have kids. It all depends. And the most important thing for me, at least, is that you don't have to do this for the money. You want to do this because you have a passion for it. You want to do this because you want to make the world a safer place. And it's also something I want to stress that George mentioned a few slides back. The red team exists to make the blue team better. The red team does not exist to rub it in the blue team's face like, haha, we pwned your environment, we are now domain admin. That's not what red teaming is about. At the end of the day, if you're an ethical hacker, you want to make the world safer. And you do that by showing the blue team their gaps in logging and monitoring. And you do that in a collaborative way and in a structured way, not a destructive way. I think that's very important.
Yeah, and to that last point of it being a journey, 100%, right? We're always learning new things. As you get better, the blue team is also getting better. The defenders are getting better, which then force you to get better, which forces them to get better, right? And I mean, just, I'm a part of InfoSec Twitter, right? And just seeing some of the conversations there, even today, Jean had one. I think it was with Mark from Outflank. You guys were talking about getting around a particular antivirus through, I think it was a driver for Microsoft or something like that. And you're just reading there and you're learning new stuff, new ideas come out. I think that one in particular you bypass by using Avast AV, right?
Yeah. So what happened there was that Mark has a training as well, a training environment, but Defender by extent got smarter these days with tamper protection, and it's getting really hard to get rid of Defender forever, basically. So a good strategy is to actually just install a different antivirus, which you can just disable forever instead of relying on Defender, and that's how you can bypass the Defender problem.
There you go. And just as you go through, we learn new things every day, and that's the beauty of it.
For sure. Yeah, this is also something we want to stress. We are actually very open community, and you see a lot of the same names coming back on Twitter, especially with Red Team, with Blue Team. You have names like Rastamouse, you have names like Florian Roth. But I think one of the common denominators is that we're actually quite open. So if you have a question, feel free to always ask, but just don't ask us to do your homework, because then you'll probably get shamed online as well. So it kind of depends. If you want to ask us something, sure, but don't ask us to do your homework, because that will end up badly for you.
Yep, and I mean, and this is like an area where there's a balance, right? Like if you go online and you ask questions, right? Most of the time you're gonna get good responses back, and sometimes, yeah, there's gonna be some forums where people are trying to gatekeep, but that's generally not the case. A lot of people think that's the norm, and it's not, right? Definitely ask questions, but when you get an answer, go and look it up, right? If I'm seeing here someone is asking, just as an example, Mike Clark is asking, what sort of TTPs do you use to prioritize what to learn first? I feel overwhelmed with stuff I need to learn and don't know where to start. I try to be patient, but it's difficult. So a question like this, excellent. First of all, you ask the question. Step number one, fantastic. I'm going to give you some tools now. One that I would tell you to start with is ATT&CK. They are a very low sophistication threat actor from China. They have been observed years ago. They use open source tools like Empire. And I would point you to the C2 Matrix how-to site. And we actually walk you through how you can emulate some of these. And it just so happens that a lot of those TTPs used by that APT are very common ones that you can look at, right? Things like PowerShell for execution, command line tools, standard command and control through HTTP and HTTPS. So if I were to tell Mike this, right, he can go check out all this stuff. But if he doesn't read the page, and I know he doesn't read, and he just comes back and asks another question, I'm going to say, hey, did you read the page I told you, right? Because that's doing your homework, right? So there is a balance on that, but definitely ask the question. And I'll give you more on that, Mike. That was a fantastic question. And again, post them if you've got them. But what about coding?
Yeah, so this is something I get asked a lot, especially since I started developing some more open source tooling. I see a lot of questions popping up on my Twitter and on my LinkedIn as well, where people just basically ask me, how do I start writing code for exploitation? And that's basically, I think, a wrong entry point there. I don't think you should start writing codes immediately for exploitation. You first should get a proper foundation in how to code in general. And I think that once you start learning a code language, it's easier to transition into other code languages, because most code I'm not saying every code language, but most code languages are based on the same core principles, and it's easier to translate them once you start actually getting into coding. And how you can do that is by first of all thinking of a solid use case. It could be offensive, it could not be. It kind of depends on what you want to do. But strategize, think of a solid first use case, and then start Googling. Just start Googling, start using Stack Overflow, start looking for good resources. My go-to resources for offensive tooling are definitely ByteLeader. Big shout out to his offensive NIM repository, where he started experimenting with NIM which is not a new language, but he basically figured out it could be a very interesting language to use offensively, and he just started pushing code to a GitHub repo called Offensive Nim. And you could take that as a baseline to basically extend into any coding language you want. They have some very easy to read and understand code examples there that can do offensive things. And if you want to port that out to any other language that you want, you can definitely do so. So I think you don't necessarily need to have coding experience in order to land a pen testing or a red team job, but being able to read and understand code will definitely aid you, because you don't want to just be a script kiddie and download something from GitHub, which you don't have a clue how it works. It pops your reverse shell, but it backdoors the customer's environment with some Chinese backdoor or something. You definitely don't want that to happen. So I think it's a very good starting point to first learn how to read and understand code. And once you know that, you can start trying to write some code as well.
Yep. And with that said, it's also a nice to have, not a requirement, right? If you don't know any code whatsoever, don't feel like you must learn it. I think being able to read it is going to be important, especially nowadays. A lot of what the code we see, right? Python, Ruby for things on Metasploit, just as an example of things you download from the internet and run. But obviously the shift to C# and whatnot. Like, I'm not a coder, nor do I say I am. I'll modify some stuff and pray it works. But even if you don't write, at least being able to read would be great. But also don't let that deter you from coming and doing some stuff. Now, I got a great question here by Andrew Mitchell on training and how are traditional college degrees viewed in the industry versus certifications. So want to decouple all of these, right? We actually have a slide on training and a slide on certification. So training, I'll hit the college one first. That is going to depend on who is hiring. I worked for 10 years in a large financial that would only hire people that had college degrees. I found an exception process to get a couple of folks in there, but that was a couple out of 140 we had globally that did not have a college degree. So it depends on the industry. I think having the college degree and kind of shows that you know how to learn and kind of follow things. But many hackers, right? I guess that's a little bit of a stereotype. And Jean mentioned it as well, right? Like we didn't really like that whole authority thing of like, oh, you have to read this and you have to learn this and you have to study this, right? But at the end of the day, it's gonna be important in some industries, and it's gonna and it's not gonna be important in others, right? So my example was the financial industry. They generally want that. See, little by little, they're changing that. Now, the other training that's going to be more specific to our talk here, right, is becoming a red teamer. We already covered the basics, right? You should know how things work, right? The basics of hacking and whatnot. But what training do you take? So say, oh, I'm already a blue teamer, want to get into red teaming. That's probably the right time to go and take some training, right? And there's a bunch of them. I couldn't even list them all here. Obviously, it's a SANS webcast. I want to promote the SANS course that I just updated and released, which is Security 564, Red Team Exercises and Adversary Emulations. It's a 2-day course. We're working on a 6-day one that's more Red Team operations, right? Where it's way more hands-on. My 2-day course is more half management, like you're building a red team program. There's a lot that goes into it, a lot of planning that goes into it. It's not just writing a report at the end, for example. There's actually analysis and response to attacks and whatnot. So there's the purple team courses, 599 and 699, which were written by the fine folks of Nviso and Eric Van Vugenat. I think I said that right. And I know Jean has written a little bit of it. He's also a co-teacher there. But there's a bunch of other ones, right? There's some online that might be a little more cost effective if you're getting in. 0-point security was a big one, right? Rasta Mouse, shout out to him, awesome contributor to the community. There's Pen Test Academy, there's BC Security that has their own course. Those folks are the ones that maintain Empire, which is one of the most popular command and control frameworks. You have 40 North, right? I think you have SpectreOps. I'm already thinking of others. So there's a number of them, all based on what you want to get out of them, right? There's some that teach you the whole program part, how to be methodological, how to follow the frameworks and whatnot, while others are purely hands-on and assume that you already know, and you're coming from a pen tester background and you already know how Active Directory works. So now do these attacks, and they start teaching you, things like Kerberoasting and silver tickets and golden tickets and things like that. So there's many options. Again, it's all based on you. Everyone is different. That's why I'm not just going to sit here and tell you to take my course, but there's many for these, and if you can afford taking a combination of them. That's one of the things that most organizations understand, is that this is always changing, right? You have to level up, you have to stay current. When I was in my 20s going through this, I had a goal of doing one particular certification per year. So that I talked with my bosses, it was all expected, it was in the budget, and thankfully they were able to pay that. Not sure if you have any other comments on this one, Jean, or if you want to talk about certifications.
Well, I wanted to shout out one that is noticeably missing here on this slide, probably because we just simply ran out of space, and it's Hack the Box, because it's basically free. You have to hack your way in, by the way. There's already a challenge to get in, which is quite nice. So you have to hack your way in. It's a free platform where you can start meeting some other very friendly people in the InfoSec industry and start learning together as well, and start owning some boxes, which is quite nice. Then another common question, even here in the webcast as well, but also on Twitter and LinkedIn, is, do you really need certification? Well, the short answer there is probably not, but it can really help you pass some HR gates. For example, a very common one here is the OSCP. I think it's also probably one of the most well-known offensive security certificates. If you have it, it's definitely very nice to have, because it will help you probably pass the most HR gates from all certifications that you can have. I think OSCP is the one that pops up the most, right, George?
Yes, especially for a technical role in pen testing, that's definitely one that they're going to ask for the most, and also it's more attainable. And I know they just went through a whole bunch of rewrites and changes. I haven't seen the new one, but that again is based on how you learn, right? That one in particular, they have the whole try harder mantra, which means that you're gonna have to figure out a lot of things on your own. So if that is a way that you learn, and everyone learns different, right? Then that's probably a good one for you. So that covers the people part, right? And someone asked here about frameworks and about what is there out there and what can we follow. So industry wise, not regulatory framework wise, there's a few. The first one is the cyber kill chain, and this one has been around for a long time. It's pretty much how a threat actor operates, and it's 7 steps, and we know it's simple and it has a number of flaws, but it actually got a lot of people to understand how an attacker works. And to this day, you might still need to map back to this kill chain. So that's one that you can look at. The other one was Paul Pohl's. He put out the unified cyber kill chain. This really fixed a lot of the gaps from the Lockheed Martin one. The industry standard pretty much for doing and testing things like detection and response from a red team perspective, and really from a CTI perspective and a forensics perspective, is MITRE attack. So that's the one we're going to talk about here. And then a little self plug here for the Purple Team exercise framework. This is a framework that you can actually use as a zero knowledge framework as well. But what I argue in writing this one is Purple teaming is not just red and blue. You also leverage cyber threat intelligence. Someone asked the question of like, oh, I'm overwhelmed with all these TTPs. Well, if you do an adversary emulation, you only have to focus on the TTPs of a particular threat actor that's likely to attack you. And you know that based on cyber threat intel, you extract those TTPs. Then there's a lot of preparation that goes into this. A lot of people think red teaming is just like going in and getting access. The prep work and the lessons learned is actually a significant amount as well. And of course, the actual exercise execution. So in this case, MITRE attack is what we're going to talk about. It stands for adversary tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. And really, it's like a common language. Prior to attack, the red team would find some awesome stuff and draft it up, and the blue team would read it and be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Or we'd read a cyber threat intelligence report of something that occurred, and dense report, 40 pages, and there was not common knowledge, right? So with this, they have broken out these adversary behaviors in tactics. There's 14 high-level adversary goals, if you wish, right? Reconnaissance, resource development, gaining initial access, execution, defense evasion. I'm probably not going to go through it because I'm going to realize I've memorized that, and that's sad.
Don't forget exfiltration.
Exfiltration, right? Command and control, impact, right? Credential access. So those are the high-level goals. And then within each of these high-level goals, you have techniques and sub-techniques. That is how the adversary is achieving their goals. And then deeper at the micro level, you have the procedures, which is actually what you're typing, what tool you're using, etc. So each technique can technically have multiple procedures, right? But this really brought us all together. It really fostered that collaboration between what the offensive teams were doing, what the defenders were doing, what the incident response was doing, what the cyber threat intelligence was doing. And I was waiting to answer this question, Aiden, that you had for this slide, because MITRE has a lot of other projects. They have CVE, right? Common vulnerabilities and exposure, right? And that didn't go away. That's not going away. Finding vulnerabilities and exploiting them will continue to be something very valuable that the industry should do. So if you are really good at exploit development and you're hearing people talk about red team and you feel like you're missing out, don't feel that way. There's a lot of value in what you're doing. And that's why I mentioned the ethical hacking maturity model isn't steps. Like, you're not doing the previous one. But for red teaming, I do want you to see the evolution here of you're not only finding things in technology, you're now also working to find things in people and process and in these procedures, these TTPs that we're never going to be able to prevent, right? Like running Who Am I is not something you're going to be able to prevent, or running PowerShell is not something you're going to be able to prevent. So what the focus turns to, and what we've seen in the industry, is this whole assumed breach perspective, right? Where organizations more and more know for a fact that they are going to get compromised, right? And they're not going to be able to prevent that actor, right? At one point, you're going to have a patch that you forgot to apply in that one system. That's all it's going to take. Or someone's going to click on that phishing link, right? The question is, what do you do now? Now the attacker's on your court. So you need to be able to identify and respond to that. And that's really where our red teams start, right? Because I mentioned red teaming is not only technology, but when you do build a red team program for the first time, this is probably going to be your focus, because this is going to bring the most value, right? But as a red teamer, you should still be looking at anything, at a brand new process, at a new team that's coming on board, etc. So this is our mandatory slide on MITRE attack. You can't have a red team talk. This is actually part of the rules. When you all get into red teaming and you start doing talks, and would love to see those, definitely invite us. You have to have this slide, right? Because we talk about MITRE attack. So the last part here, and just being cautious of the time, is technology. There are a lot of tools, right? There's the whole offensive security tools that are published. Jean mentioned a few of those. But if you're getting started, right, just being conscious of our audience here today, where I would recommend you start is with a command and control framework. Command and control framework allows you to set up a server out on the internet or on your machine. It allows you to create a payload that will then be executed in the target environment. And then you interact with it. And it allows you to do a lot of the things on MITRE ATT&CK. All of them are different. And there's a ton of these available for you. So many that we created an entire Google Doc of all the C2 frameworks. This was released back in Hackfest, actually Hackfest, there we go. I knew I wore this shirt for a reason. At Hackfest 2019, there was like 30 C2s on there. We're over 60 now. Can you believe that, John? That's more crazy. C2s are coming out all the time, right? Your friend Rasta Mouse has one on there, Sharp C2. So, you know, this is a great starting point because a lot of those are free. And what we wanted to do here is provide these for you and really provide a method for you to get started playing with some of these items. So I'm gonna give you the SANS promise here and then switch over and show you how to do this. So installing these C2s, at least a few of them are well documented and are pretty easy, but once you start installing multiple, they start breaking your VM. So what we did is with SANS, with Ryan O'Grady, shout out to him, we created a SANS Slingshot C2 Matrix Edition virtual machine. It's a free machine that you can download right now, and it comes with 8 command controls already installed. So when you ask, hey, how do I get started? This is how you can get started, right? And you can play with this in your own environment, right? You're not gonna go out and do this in your work or anything like this. You set up a couple of VMs. We actually have walkthroughs on how to set up your own lab, and you start playing with these C2s and you start understanding how they work. You see what modules they already have available. See, you know, some of them have Mimikatz and some of them have the ability to move laterally with, I don't know, SMB or WMI, etc. And you just go through this and you play with it. So that's the SANS promise. I definitely want to give some time for that. I'm going to show it. And then, of course, I got to shout out my class, right? So SEC 564, it's a 2-day class. We cover everything from cyber threat intelligence to preparation to setting up attack infrastructure. We actually used that C2 Matrix Slingshot for that class because it has multiple ones. And then you gain access, you emulate various behaviors, and then you close it out by actually providing value. Which leads me to that final thing. And this is really a call to action, right? That if you are going to be a red team or do anything in offensive security, it's all about bringing value. Jean mentioned that as well, right? It's all about bringing value. Focus on your organization, whether you're internal or if you're a consultant, right? Understand the target environment, understand what their concerns are, and help them to see where those issues are, right? And then Jean also mentioned this, right? Like, don't go in and be like, yeah, I owned you, you all suck, yeah. No, not cool, not cool. That does not foster collaboration. That doesn't help anyone improve and things like that. So with that, let me jump over here to a live demo because we have a few minutes left and I see some questions popping up. But to get started, you can go to thec2matrix.com. And then over here in documentation, you got a Git book. And yes, I made it into a Git book because it's so much easier to update. The next page here is the SANS C2 Slingshot. It comes with Covenant, Empire, Coadic, Merlin, Metasploit, Posh, Silent Trinity, and Sliver. What more do you want to get started? So you can download that. And here we walk through how to set that up. If you want to create a C2 Matrix lab for going through various C2s, or if you just want a very basic lab, right? Just have an attacker and a victim VM. And then someone mentioned how to get started, right? I'm a little overwhelmed. Here, if you click on Empire, probably one of the more reliable and consistent C2s that you can use. It's not gonna be crashing on you, or running the same command 3 different times will give you the same thing, right? And here you can go through here. We actually have an emulation plan for APT-19. So this is for Mike, kind of where do I start? And the reason I chose this is because I've studied a lot of threat actors, and this is a great one to get started. It has the basics of command and control over HTTP. They get in through spear phishing. It leverages PowerShell. Does basic discovery, persistence with run keys, right? Like very typical things that you will see most threat actors go through. And here we walk through how to do most of that. So you can definitely get started now. And yeah, let me see what questions, or Jean, if you have any other notes or anything else to share.
No, I think timing wise, we're almost practically perfect timing. We still have about 5 minutes left for some additional questions, if there are any. I think we, if I look over to the question screen, we actually covered all of them, I think. So.
Yeah, someone asked about SANS 560, excellent course, right? That's network pen testing, but the focus is penetration testing, right? If that's the track that you want to get into, by all means, that's a great place to start. I think someone mentioned the Red Siege assumed breach webinar. Yep, shout out to folks of Red Siege. Have you noticed a shift to C# to obfuscate and run PowerShell when it's whitelisted? It's a great question. You want to talk a little bit about C#, Jean? I know you have a couple projects.
Sure. So basically, not really. We don't obfuscate and to run PowerShell, because how PowerShell inherently works is it's basically just a wrapper around the .NET core. So what happens is PowerShell is actually just an automation DLL that you can leverage from C# as well. So you don't necessarily need to spawn any PowerShell or anything related to PowerShell in your C# code. So what happens the most of the time now these days is, in order to remain in memory completely, we just leverage C# and its native functions over PowerShell, because PowerShell tends to get flagged more often these days, because just how the defense industry grew over time. So we have the script block logging, we have AMSI. Of course, we have AMSI now in C# as well, but it's easier to bypass in C# because you have so much control over it, since you basically start coding in the same interfaces that PowerShell also uses. So we don't necessarily do anything C# related in order to spawn PowerShell, but that being said, we still can, of course. It's not impossible to leverage C# in order to spawn a PowerShell prompt. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Michael.
Awesome. No, yeah, I'm going through here, and yeah, I think that covers all the questions. Yeah, so final slide. Thank you for coming and being with us today. As I mentioned, if you want to learn more about this, we have a 2-day Red Team course that was just updated. Teaches you how to build the program, covers cyber threat intelligence, covers going through an entire adversary emulation, and of course, providing value. So we have labs on vector and how to track and how to measure the people, how they responded, if they followed their processes, and really ultimately answer the question that most CISOs have when they see someone get hacked is, can that happen to us? You should be able to answer that question. So thank you all for your time. Thank you, Jean, for joining me
Thanks
today.
for having me.
Yeah, no, awesome. And yeah, that's it. I don't know if Carol, you have any closing words, but we're done on our end.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, George and Jean-François, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.